Well, time goes on. And by the 1960s, America is in the most hated conflict it's ever been in. The Vietnam War. And I was a school principal down here in Houston at the time. We were losing 500 men a week for a war that couldn't be won. And the number of cripples. I recently read the biography of one of them, Fortunate Son. His father was Chesty Puller, worked his way up from private to a 3-star general in the Marine Corps. Never had any fear. Went through several wars. Stood out in the open in every one and let people shoot at him. Was never touched. His son goes out as a second lieutenant. About the 3rd month into it, he blows both his legs off. He's paralyzed from the neck down. Mm-hmm. And it's a story of the struggle. What do you do without a body? It's not something you think about when you're signing up. What do you do without a body? And he wrote a fantastic prize-winning book, Fortunate Son. 3 years later, he committed suicide. Mm-hmm. That's hard to do when you don't have any use of your limbs. I don't know how he did it, but he managed. We would have riots now about the Iraq War if we had the draft. That's the variable. Right now it's a presidential candidate issue, but we're not finding people marching. We're not finding the unrest on university campuses we saw in Vietnam. At least now, if you want to get yourself paralyzed, you have to volunteer. So that's the big difference. So the Adventist Church, in the midst of this most hated war, or should we call it a police action, must face the issue of the military. That brings us to 1972 and the latest statement by the denomination on the military service. It's a very finely crafted statement. This is the Annual Council in Mexico City, October 14 to 20, 1972. Voted that we accept as our basic view the 1954 General Conference Session action entitled The Relationship of Seventh-day Adventists to Civil Government and War. Now, 1954, that's in relationship to the Korean police action. None of these are declared wars, okay? Genuine Christianity manifests itself in good citizenship and loyalty to civil government. That's good. That's Romans 13. The breaking out of war among men in no way alters the Christian's supreme allegiance and responsibility to God, or modifies his obligation to practice his beliefs and put God first. So they set the stage of the tension of the two kingdoms in the first paragraph. We have a responsibility to the government, but our supreme responsibility is to God. This partnership with God through Jesus Christ, who came into this world not to destroy men's lives, but to save them, causes Seventh-day Adventists to advocate a non-combatant position, following their divine master in not taking human life, but rendering all possible service to save it. as they accept the obligation of citizenship as well as its benefits. Their loyalty to government requires them willingly to serve the state in any non-combatant capacity, civil or military, in war or peace, in uniform or out of it, which will contribute to saving life, asking only that they may serve in those capacities which do not violate their conscientious convictions. That's the statement of a world church. General principles for all nations. The above statement, now listen, now we're going to get to the moderating aspect of it. That is the statement of ideals for a Christian church. The above statement is not a rigid position binding church members, but gives guidance, leaving the individual member free to assess the situation for himself. And then it goes into specific reference to the United States. The United States, of course, not only had a draft up to the end of the Vietnam War, but it also had a non-combatant option in that draft. When I was 18, I had to go fill out a draft card, and you had to choose one of three categories. You would either be drafted as a combatant or a non-combatant, or you would be drafted into civilian service. But you would be drafted. That was it. Unless you had kids or were in school, and you could get a deferment. 1. For members in the United States, the counsel of the Church is that the above action is best reflected at present by 1AO classification, military service as a non-combatant, under Selective Service System regulations. That's what they recommended. 2. A member in the United States making his personal decision on how to fulfill his obligated term of service to the country shall first consider the historic teachings of the Church on non-combatancy, which could lead him to choose the 1AO classification. If, because of personal convictions, he chooses to seek other than 1AO classification, his pastor, teacher, or other church worker should aid him in satisfying the legal requirements for securing the classification of his choice and should minister to his spiritual needs. So here we are. This is the position of the church. This is what we recommend. But if people do other things, then they need to have, it was fairly intensive work with pastors. Nothing was accidental 30 or 40 years ago. This was all very conscious. And I'll get to that in a minute, because I can't believe how much things have changed. For those choosing the 1O classification, civilian alternative service in place of military service, pastoral guidance and counsel should be provided when it is established that such a request is based on consistent religious experience. Pastors, teachers, or other workers should provide statements of their personal knowledge of the man's position on the following: church membership, attendance and participation in church services, personal standards of conduct, previous expressions of belief supporting his request for the 1O classification. Those providing such statements should request the draft board to request and honor the man's personal convictions. Such statements will be placed in the registrant's hand to be used at his discretion. B. For those who conscientiously choose the 1A classification, military service as a combatant, personal guidance and counsel should be provided in ministering to their needs, since the church refrains from passing judgment on them. Here we have the other side. You might say in the New Testament you have the loving Jesus who wanted to save lives, but you still got the Old Testament. There is this strain, so the church has always held room for those who differ with what it considers to be the New Testament position. That is still the official position of the church today. However, there is no draft today. I want to talk about my personal experience just a bit. Now, by the way, I'll do that for my personal experience. I, as you know, was raised agnostic, and I didn't want to be drafted. Non-Christian. I didn't want to have kids. I didn't want to go to college. And I didn't want to go in the army. So back in those days, we had a choice. We could do what's called the 6-month program. You could join for 6 months and then have 5.5 years of reserve. And if you were under 18 and a half, you had 7.5 years reserve. And I'd already been in the military once, and then pretending to be a naval officer. I knew I hated the military. So I took the 6 months and had 7.5 years reserve. At which time I could be called up any time. And my unit was called up for the Berlin Wall crisis. And then the next year was the missile crisis when Khrushchev was putting missiles on Cuba, atomic warheads. And that's as close as the world ever came to blowing itself up. It's much more serious than most of us recognize now with the documents we have now. As I was a trained infantry person, trained to kill. That's a nasty way of saying it, but that's what it is. Trained to put holes in other people's bodies with bullets. And I began to become an Adventist. I began to get convictions before I ever joined the church about Sabbath keeping and the bearing of arms. Now, there's a reason I came to these conclusions. A young person today wouldn't even know about these things. At least Sabbath keeping they would. But you see, the church was very active, had a teaching program. They had all kinds of literature. Young people got all kinds of pamphlets about what to do with the military, how to fill out your draft things, how to get one AO conviction. And it was always there. They were always educating. It's very active. We had, like I said the other day, we had in our schools what do you call that again? The Civilian Cadet Corps.
Yeah, medical cadet corps.
Medical Cadet Corps. And they even opened up Fort Sam Houston. The United States government opened up an entire fort just for the Adventists. And it's still there, Fort Sam Houston, to train medics. This was a big thing. Everybody knew about it. And here I'm becoming an Adventist. And suddenly I decided, this is it. I'm not going to kill anybody. I want to be like Jesus. And I still remember my first run-in. Back in those days, we had target practice. Half the people would be in the pits. We'd pull down the targets, count the score, send the targets back up. And the other guys were firing. So I spent the morning in the pits. In the afternoon, I traded with another guy. And I was still in the pits. And the lieutenant found me. He said, "You were here this morning." I said, "That's right, sir." He said, "Why?" And I told him, "Brother, it was not a very happy occasion." Then I went to my summer training camp. Because reservists have to go. And I refused to march on Sabbath. And that's when I needed to be rescued by the chaplain. So I phoned up a chaplain, a full colonel, also fully drunk. I interrupted him. He was an Episcopalian. I interrupted him and got him away from the general's party. Oh man, I've never seen such a mad man in all my life. He was upset. And he threatened me with a court-martial. He says, you get out there and do what you're told, otherwise you are dead meat. Well, I didn't particularly want to go to jail, you know. But I wasn't about ready to back down either. This is something I believed in. These were two great principles. I've come to the conclusion there is absolutely no way I can love my enemy and kill him at the same time. And there was no way that they were going to make me do regular work on Sabbath. I'd already quit my job in civilian life because there was no future. No, it was not a good paid job. And that's when I told you the other day, my captain came and said, look, we got a big problem here. He said, if you don't know it, I'm a Jew. Go sit in my office, read your Bible on Sabbath. Comes to be lunchtime, we free up everybody else, you're free too, go do what you want. I never had to face that. That same week was a providential week in my life with the military. I was in a low priority call-up unit. We were a basic training unit. In case of mobilization, we would be not too quick to be called up, and I'd typed up orders of transfer to a high priority unit, ship-to-shore operations, driving ducks. Because I had to move. That's where my new unit would be. And I stopped at the PX, get a soda pop, and read the headlines. Kennedy is calling up 1 million reserves, which he did. 1 million reserves were being called up because Khrushchev had built the Berlin Wall. Well, I knew that I did not want to be one of those 1 million. And so I typed up letters of attachment. I was attached to the unit in Eureka, California. I did not belong to the unit. So when the unit was called up, which it was, they were called up for a year, I was not a member. I was the only person in the unit not called up. The next year I was off to Pacific Union College studying for ministry, and the Cuban crisis hit. They only took 1/3 of a million men. But by that time, I'd been working construction so long, they couldn't figure out where I was, so they put me in the inactive reserve. But it's a whole different world out there today. In my day, there were no incentives for joining, even if you were dirt poor. We got $50 a month. And out of that, we had to buy a lot of stuff that the Army required. I mean, $50 a month. And that was before they took out our Social Security. They took out taxes too, but we never ever had to pay it because when you make $600 a year, you don't have anything. But still, when I was in the service, some of these guys had never seen $1 in their life. Well, we had a bunch of guys from the hills of Tennessee somewhere. They must have been really far up. And they'd already joined for 3 years. And somebody said, if you sign for another 3 years, we'll give you $300. Man, they were so excited they were delirious. They'd never seen $300 in their life. But now, when my brother come along, and it's an all-volunteer army, then they began to get big incentives for joining and for rejoining. And if you don't have much, that looks like a lot of money. It's not quite as good now as it used to be, but if you join special forces, if you re-up, whew. So, what happened? The draft stopped. And because Adventists did not volunteer for the service, because when you volunteer you lose rights to complain, Adventists did not volunteer. That was our history. When the government did it, then they had a responsibility to handle you properly. But when you volunteer, it's a different thing. So what happened? We had never had a volunteer problem. We stopped all the programs of education and in the conferences and the general conference. We just stopped. And over the next 20 or 30 years, we lost a lifestyle issue for which Adventist young men had lost their lives in places like the Soviet Union because they would not surrender their convictions. Now, we have no convictions. Most of the young pastors I find, they don't even know we have a position when something as serious as taking life.
We threw a party for somebody who joined the military to go in Iraq, and it was a big celebration in our church.
Oh yeah, yeah, we've taken. I think we have to walk a delicate line here. So now, after all these years, and after the whole lifestyle issue, I would consider of some importance, has been lost, part of our distinctive heritage. Now we find the General Conference spouting on, the President, he's had several articles recently that we ought to regain this, and there's a Journal of Adventist Education, Peacemaking and Adventist Education. I've got an article in there. Here it is, the Great Disappearance, Adventism and Non-Combatancy. It just disappeared. But the moral issues, and here we are not dealing with issues like, should I eat a piece of chicken? No, you're dealing with an issue, should I take a human life? And should I premeditate about it? This has never been an easy issue, but the big problem now is one of education, where the church even has the conviction to stand by what it once thought was so important, which I believe is New Testament important. Who knows? But we stand in the making of Adventist history. We have a flavor of Adventism today that our young men and women, that our church members would not even recognize as being Adventist. In Vietnam, Korea, World War II, First World War, Civil War. Here's a lifestyle issue that had a great struggle in being born and died a very peaceful death. How to relate to culture. How to relate to Caesar. When Caesar says, do something that God forbids in the Christian dispensation. These are serious questions. I once tried to teach this course in Africa. I would never teach lifestyle in Africa. Because the missionaries didn't teach them everything we believed. And so over there, the conference presidents are saying, because they're nearly all conference presidents in my class, they said, we didn't know we taught this, because a lot of their head lay people happen to be colonels in some of these African armies. And I'm going to tell you right now, being a colonel or an African army is not a vegetarian affair, okay? It's a hard-fisted operation. These are not easy questions. Well, yesterday, we noted that there were in the 20th century, there were, well, in the United States of America, in World War II, we had a fair number of men in prison because they would not bear arms. That's how strong the church felt. They spent the entire, and they were sentenced for up to 50, 60 years in prison because they would not bear arms. Now, we talked a little bit about a parallel situation. I'd like you to comment the other day, and that is sending of children to school on Sabbath. Can you help us a little bit there on the Romanian situation anyway?
Well, after World War II, World War II, Russians took Romania and all other satellites, and they imposed this 6 days and Sunday free, and it was a struggle because they installed as a conference presidents and union presidents some puppets. And of course they are trying to impose everybody to send the children to the schools because this is not a Sabbath issue, because we are not working. It's just part of our education. And it was the moment when the reform movement was strong enough. They supported this rebellion against authorities and not sending the children, and of course against military. And several of them were in prison for their conviction. I struggled myself with this, but my father found a very easy solution: bribing the principal of the school. And I was like in the class, but I was in the church. It was not a something morally, political correct.
It worked.
But it worked. It worked. And the same with the military. We find ways to,
circumvent the law.
bribing. This was the issue. Going there and say, my son wants to join the paramedic corps. And so I was trained as a paramedic. And I never bear arms. But I know my colleagues, several colleagues of mine, they spend time in prison for this.
Yeah.
They spend time in prison. Even today, the church is somehow not split, but arguing over that period of time. Because
this is one reason when I had students that wanted to come and write the history of the Austrian church and some of the other issues dealing with Russia, as well as Nazi Germany, I said no dissertation, unless you deal it before World War I.
Very wise.
These people are living, and no matter what you say, it'll tear up the church. Because these things go on between the collaborators.
Yes.
Who may have repented, may not. Let's face it, they saved their own skin, while other people lost theirs, sometimes because of what they did. So the Adventist church these are not jokes. Some of these lifestyle issues, keeping Sabbath and bearing arms, these are not jokes.
I know.
They could cost you your life. They could cut. If you want to read a good book, Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan.
Ivan Denisovich.
That's it.
I wrote it.
That's required reading. Now,
good.
In fact, if you guys want to read a good short book, One Day, and Solzhenitsyn spent a lot of time in the Soviet Gulag. In fact, if you really want to read something big, there's 3 big volumes, Gulag Archipelago, which I have not quite finished. I started reading it some years ago, but I got the idea. But One Day in the Life of Ivan.
One Day in the Life of Ivan.
Yeah.
Ivan Denisovich.
Yeah, you'll have to spell that for him. Well, I just call it One Day in the Life of Ivan. That'll get you can Google that. It'll get it up for you. That
Good stuff.
is required reading for everybody.
Nobel Prize.
What's that?
You got Nobel Prize for
Yeah.
this one.
The Seventh-day Adventist.
No. They wanted to have him come speak at Andrews one time. I was all for that because this was required reading in my class, History of Religious Liberty. And it's a fictional character, Ivan is, but he's not fiction. It's not fiction. It's a composite of what he experienced. And it's a short book. It's only 120 pages or something like that. So it's not a big read, but totalitarianism is something that we do not understand. Right now, President Mugabe.
Zimbabwe.
I've had personal dealings with President Mugabe of Zimbabwe. Right now they have 100,000% inflation per year. Can you imagine what 100,000%? That's 3,000% a day. I don't know what the average pastor makes, but just figure what 3,000% inflation would be in 1 month. These things are not simple. I was in Zimbabwe, and I wanted to take my wife to Victoria Falls. Actually, I was going to drive up from South Africa, where I've been lecturing, but I ran out of time, so we flew in. And we were going to camp on the Serengeti, so I figured I can afford to spend first-class money. We're going to stay in Victoria Falls for 2 days. So I spent a lot of money for a hotel in Victoria Falls, because the rest of the time we're going to be camping out with the lions and the elephants. And we had a Messiah warrior to guard our tents. At any rate, so I told my wife, don't worry, I paid $350 a night for this hotel. It is first class. I've been there. I've never ever since or before that time, but you know, I didn't have time to fool around. Africa's a terrible place. One time I got into a place and my plane had, was going to take off. It's out of Kenya, Nairobi, and Nairobi is very civilized by and large. You know, 12 hours later I was still waiting for my airplane. And I fell asleep, so I tied my suitcase to my leg. Really, I had it tied to my leg. And I had to bribe all the guards, the security, because my suitcase was on the other side, and I said, I'll never see it again. So I did my usual bribe. I put $1 in his hand, and he looked at it and said, oh, you got? So, okay, 5. That's the only way you can get through and get things done. That's the way those countries operate. Is it wrong to bribe? Yeah, they were going to give me a shot one time in Zanzibar. You ain't giving me a shot. I forgot that what I needed was a $5 bill and my passport, for crying out loud. What's wrong with me? You know what I mean? They're not touching me with one of their AIDS-infected needles. I give them $100. I eventually argued my way out of it. What you say, is a bribery wrong? Do you want to get anything done? That's the way the system operates.
Yeah.
It's the lesser of two evils. You get your camera stuck in Nigeria, $1,200 to get it out.
Yeah, they do that in
Well, it's either that or lose the purpose of why you went to Nigeria. This is the real world out there, in probably more places than less. So anyway, I get to this place, and we see all these fancy limousines at this hotel and everything else. And I say to my wife, everybody's dressed in fancy clothes. I said, don't worry, I paid for my room 6 months ago. So I went up there. And the guy says, well, if somebody's in your room, they won't be out. Just go sit down over there. I said to my wife, look, you go sit down. This is Africa. I'll take care of this. I figured I needed to find a $5 bill in my pocket, go up and see the cleaning lady and say, you know, get this room cleaned up, and here you are. I got up there, and there's all these guys with these antennas sticking out their ears with submachine guns, AK-47s. And I'm the only guy that looks white up there. The president of the Gold Coast is using my room when it's right next to Mugabe's suite.
Oh.
And suddenly I didn't find myself giving $5 to a maid. I found myself surrounded with AK-47s all pointed in my direction. And I said, this is no time to back up. There's no graceful way out of this. And so I said, you know, they were beginning to pressure me, and I said, this is my room. And by that time, I had about 30 of these guys from 2 different countries hanging on me. And they were all armed to the teeth. And I didn't back out. Probably should have. Finally, they sent a guy out, and we talked for a while. Continued on for a while. Another guy came out, cabinet level. We talked for a while. He says to me, look, we've got to use your room for about another 3 hours. He said, well, I'll give you my room, we'll trade. Well, I wasn't sure they'd understand that in the desk, so I said, why don't you come down with me, man? At that time, I realized that I was pretty close to biting it. He gave me a look that I never forgot. I said, okay, I'll take care of it. and suddenly I realized, in that kind of a situation, an American could disappear. There's plenty of lions in the backyard. and these things happen. We are so comforted by having rights. They sometimes get transgressed on. But by and large, we're very comfortable. Human beings have rights. I just read the latest biography of Stalin. I'm reading the mail to Saturn right now. Killed 70 million of his own people.
Stalin?
Yeah. Stalin did 50, roughly. Hitler was just a small fry. I mean, he only killed probably 20. And most of them were Jews and Gypsies and Eastern Europe Slavs, you know, I mean, expendable sorts. Hitler, I always think Stalin was the bad guy, not Hitler. Hitler was small player. Just the Jews make a lot of noise. Killed 600,000 gypsies also. And after being in Romania for a while, I could figure out why. Okay, that's enough of that. But male killed 70 million, and they were all his own people. The dictatorial mind fascinates me, the psychology. And if you want to read a good book on World War II on the Eastern Front, what is it called? Ivan's Soldiers? I think it's Ivan's Soldiers. What makes these people move forward when they know they're going to die? Maybe without even a gun to storm Nazi fortresses than mine. No shoes, no gun. And 99% of them end up dead. What makes them do it? The totalitarian mind has fascinated me. And if I understand prophecy right, we all get treated to some of these things. That's how come I visit the Japanese prison camps. The children I grew up with, Japanese children on the West Coast, were sent to concentration camps. They had one day, their families had one day to sell everything they owned. And everybody knew it, so it was bargain day. They spent 4 years, some of them, in a Japanese concentration camp. I visited one of them over by Bishop, California. They put them in the worst possible places. It's a desert out there south of Bishop. The floor plan, I visited Dachau, outside of Munich, the same year. The American concentration camp, same floor plan. You looked at Dachau, the way the things were laid out, the way the barracks were. The American concentration camp looks just the same. This went to the Supreme Court twice. Was it just? The Supreme Court decided in time of national crisis, rights, individual rights do not exist. Come on. We're already dealing with 30 years ago. They developed a theory of like mode exits. I'm talking about some of the world's top scientists and sociologists and politicians. In time of food shortage, who gets the food? Those who cooperate. You got people who aren't cooperating? Hey, somebody's got to go. You let everybody into the lifeboat, we all sink. Now, these things are already in place. My understanding is that we will have an opportunity to be treated to some of these things before the end of world history, given sufficient crisis. Anyway, the military issue, the education of children on Sabbath, like I said before, some of these issues are not clean. Your dad had to make a moral compromise. He did the best that he could. Bribery is better than the alternative. For others, it was much more radical. And once again, I really believe, from what I can gather, life in the Soviet Union was nearly always worse than it was in the satellites. Okay, don't send your kid to school? Good, we'll take your kid. We'll raise him as a good communist. He'll not only go to school on Sabbath, but he'll do all the other good communist youth things. And you think, you see, that the first thing a totalitarian government does is take over the school system and the media and create their own Boy Scouts. No accident that we created our own Boy Scouts, Pathfinders. It's kind of lost its way now, in most places. But these are educational institutions. Hitler's youth group, the Kommissar, whatever they called it, for Stalin, those were Boy Scouts. The schools, the media, they're all educational institutions. And that's how come Adventists have got their own publishing houses, got their own Boy Scouts, these are just the way it is. Institutional lifestyle issues, yeah, they're there. How to pass on what you believe to the next generation. Anyway, this whole business of non-combatancy is just one lifestyle issue, but it's very illustrative of how we can lose something that was very valuable, is very valuable. Right now, there are I checked this with the General Conference, there are 7,500 Adventist young men and women in the military, and virtually all of them are combatants, except the chaplains. It's a world in which our fathers, in which my generation, couldn't even believe for the Adventist Church. And of course, this is not the only lifestyle issue that's up for grabs. Okay, what time is it? 10:20? What time do we? I think we're supposed to take a break, aren't we? Let's take 10 minutes. Come back at 10 minutes too. And at that time, we're going to take a look at the